My stepmother called me. I gave your trust fund money to your stepsister. You were never the favorite. I never thought my own stepmother would steal from me until she did. One phone call changed everything. Your trust fund belongs to Sophia now. You don't deserve a penny. Those were her exact words. The money my mother left for me? Gone. But what she didn't know was that I was already one step ahead. Betrayal, deception, and the ultimate revenge. This is the story of how I took everything back. Stay with me, because trust me, you're not ready for what happens next. I had spent years building a life where she couldn't reach me, where her voice was nothing more than a distant, unpleasant memory. But in less than 10 seconds, Diane Carter shattered that illusion. My suitcase was still in my hand when my phone buzzed, the name flashing on the screen stopping me in my tracks. Diane. My stomach tightened, my fingers gripping the handle just a little harder. She never called unless she wanted something. And whatever it was, I knew it wouldn't be good. I hesitated, debating whether to ignore her and let it go to voicemail. But some deep, nagging instinct made me answer. You think you deserve that money? Her voice slithered through the speaker, smug and dripping with condescension. The trust fund belongs to Sophia now. She's better than you'll ever be. The words sliced through me like a jagged knife, but I didn't flinch. Not outwardly. Years of dealing with her had taught me that any reaction, any ounce of anger or hurt, would be fuel for her satisfaction. So I forced my grip to relax, steadying myself against the hotel desk as I stared out at the Chicago skyline. Breathe. Stay calm. Don't let her win. Thanks for letting me know, I said, my voice even, almost indifferent. Silence. I could practically hear her sneer, the irritation creeping into her voice. That's all you have to say? She pressed. Sophia needs that money. For her wedding, for her new home. And you what? You're just going to waste it on some meaningless corporate career? I inhaled slowly, my jaw tightening, but I kept my tone neutral. It was never yours to give away. A scoff. Your mother left that money behind like a fool, thinking you'd actually do something worthwhile with it. But you never did. You left. You abandoned your family. Sophia deserves it more. Family. The word nearly made me laugh. Diane had spent years ensuring I was anything but family. My mind flashed back to the day she moved in, 2 years after my mother passed, sinking her claws into my father, wrapping him around her little finger until he barely resembled the man who had once held me on his shoulders and called me his little girl. Diane made sure there was no space for me in that house anymore. Sophia, her perfect, entitled daughter, became the princess overnight, while I became the outsider. My straight A's, my scholarships, my work ethic, none of it mattered. Diane controlled the narrative, painting me as ungrateful, selfish, distant. It was easier for my father to believe her than to acknowledge what he had allowed to happen. I learned quickly that nothing I did would ever be enough. So, I left. I built my own life, my own career, far away from them, and now the only thing my mother had left for me, the trust fund, meant to secure my future, Diane had stolen, or so she thought. You've always been such a disappointment, Diane sneered now, her voice laced with cruel amusement. Sophia deserves this more than you ever did. I clenched my teeth but remained eerily calm. She didn't know. 6 months ago, I had already anticipated this move. Mr. Harrison, my mother's old attorney, had flagged suspicious inquiries about the trust fund. Diane had been sniffing around, looking for loopholes, for ways to manipulate the system. So I made sure there weren't any. I worked with Mr. Harrison to tighten every legal safeguard possible, making unauthorized access impossible, and leaving a very clear paper trail if someone even tried. Diane had no idea she had just walked into a trap of her own making. I let the silence stretch, waiting, until she huffed in frustration. You're pathetic, Olivia. Running off to play career woman while your family needed you. You don't deserve a damn cent of that money. I finally let out a quiet, humorless laugh. Then I guess it's a good thing you don't get to decide that, isn't it? Another pause. A flicker of uncertainty in her breath. She wasn't expecting this. What the hell does that mean? You'll find out soon enough. Before she could respond, I ended the call and set my phone down with deliberate care. The anger was there, burning just beneath the surface, but it wasn't wild, reckless fury. No, it was something sharper, something precise. Diane had spent years manipulating, lying, controlling every situation to her advantage. I had learned from the best, but I had also learned how to be better. She thought she had won. She had no idea what was coming. I stared at my phone for a long moment after hanging up, my fingers resting lightly against the edge of the desk. The weight of Diane's words still lingered, but not in the way she had intended. She thought she had thrown me off balance, that she had stripped away my last connection to my mother, the last piece of security I had, but she had no idea. My heart wasn't racing with panic. No, it was steady, controlled. This wasn't the end of anything. It was just the beginning. I reached for my laptop and pulled up my emails, scrolling until I found the one I needed. Mr. Harrison's last update. My mother's old attorney had been keeping an eye on the trust fund for months, ever since I had gone to him with my suspicions. He had warned me that Diane was sniffing around, looking for ways in, searching for vulnerabilities. That was when we had tightened every possible legal loophole, ensuring that no money could be moved without my explicit authorization. And now, it seemed Diane had walked straight into the trap we had set for her. I clicked the call button, and Mr. Harrison picked up after the second ring. "I was expecting your call," he said, his tone calm but firm. Diane finally made her move. "She did," I confirmed, my voice cool. "She claims she transferred the trust to Sophia." A pause, then a soft chuckle. "She thinks she did, but not a single cent has been moved." I exhaled, letting that confirmation settle in my chest. "So everything's locked down?" "Every attempt she made was blocked and logged," he said. "We have records of unauthorized access, forged documents enough to prove intent. She tried to commit fraud, Olivia, and we have the evidence." I leaned back against the hotel chair, the tension in my shoulders shifting, not quite releasing, but morphing into something sharper, something more determined. "Good," I murmured. "I want to move forward with the next steps. Send everything to the family lawyer. Copy my father on every document. He needs to see this." There was a beat of silence before Mr. Harrison spoke again. "Are you sure? You know how he is with Diane." I let out a slow breath, glancing at the Chicago skyline outside my window. My father had spent years pretending not to see what was right in front of him, turning a blind eye to every cruel word, every manipulation, every calculated move Diane had made to erase me from his life. He had let her push me out, let her rewrite our family's history to fit her version of reality. But this was different. This wasn't just emotional manipulation. This was a crime. He could ignore a lot of things, but he couldn't ignore this. "He won't be able to look the other way this time," I said, my voice steady. "And if he tries, then that's on him. But I'm done pretending like this woman hasn't spent the last 20 years trying to take everything from me," Mr. Harrison sighed. "I'll take care of it. Thank you," I said before ending the call. I sat there for a few moments, staring at nothing, letting my mind process what was coming next. Then, without hesitation, I opened a new tab and booked the next flight home. I barely slept that night. The adrenaline kept my mind sharp, my body tense, as I mentally ran through every scenario that could unfold when I arrived. Diane would try to manipulate, to twist, to act like the victim she always did. Sophia would be smug, convinced that her mother had secured her future at my expense. And my father, I wasn't sure. Maybe he would fight for her. Maybe he would finally see the truth. I wasn't holding my breath. By the time I landed in Boston the next morning, the crisp autumn air bit at my skin as I stepped outside the terminal, dragging my suitcase behind me. The drive back to my childhood home was eerily familiar. The same tree-lined streets, the same perfect suburban houses, the same suffocating weight of memories pressing down on my chest. I hadn't set foot in that house in years, and yet it still had the power to make me feel 16 again, small, overlooked, unwanted. When I pulled into the driveway, I took a deep breath before stepping out. The house hadn't changed. The white shutters, the perfectly manicured lawn, the same wreath on the door that Diane had probably picked out to make the place feel like something it wasn't. I rang the doorbell, the chime echoing through the house. Footsteps approached, and when the door swung open, I was met with Diane's cold, knowing smile. Well, she mused, arms crossed. That was fast. I didn't smile back. I need to speak with Dad. She sighed dramatically, stepping aside with an exaggerated wave of her hand. Of course. Come in, dear. I stepped past her, my heels clicking against the hardwood floors as I entered the living room. My father was already sitting in his usual chair, his newspaper folded on the coffee table. Sophia sat on the couch, her arms draped over the back like she owned the place. She didn't even try to hide her smirk. Olivia, my father said, his brows furrowed. I wasn't expecting you. I leveled my gaze at him. I'm sure you weren't, but we need to talk about the trust fund. The energy in the room shifted immediately. Diane stiffened, her nails digging into her arms, while Sophia's smirk wavered just slightly. My father's eyes flickered with unease. He could already sense the storm brewing. I don't see why we need to discuss that, Diane cut in smoothly, her voice the perfect balance of patience and condescension. It's already been handled. You weren't using it anyway, and Sophia has... I know what you did, I interrupted, my voice calm but firm. I know about the unauthorized access, the forged signatures, the phone calls. I know everything. Diane's face paled, but she recovered quickly, letting out a scoff. I don't know what you're talking about. I reached into my bag, pulled out my phone, and swiped to the email Mr. Harrison had sent. The bank has records of every attempted transfer, every falsified document, every time you tried to take what wasn't yours. And now, they have a fraud investigation open against you. I turned the phone around so they could see the screen. Would you like to read the charges for yourself? My father reached for his reading glasses, but before he could, Diane snatched the phone out of my hand and scanned the screen, her face twisting as she realized what she was looking at. You little snake, she hissed under her breath, her composure slipping for the first time. You set me up. No, Diane, I said, my voice cold. You set yourself up. I just made sure I was ready when you did. Sophia shot up from the couch, her face red with anger. This is insane. Mom was just trying to make things fair. You've always had everything handed to you, Olivia, while I had to fight for everything I got. I let out a short, humorless laugh. You had to fight? I repeated. Tell me, Sophia, what exactly did you fight for? The private school Mom and Dad paid for? The brand new car you got at 16? The internship Mom arranged through her connections? Because last I checked, I worked my way through college. I paid my own rent. I built my career without anyone pulling strings for me. So please, enlighten me, what exactly have you struggled for? Sophia opened her mouth, but no words came out. My father, silent until now, finally turned to Diane. Tell me this isn't true. Diane's lips parted, but for the first time in years, she had nothing to say. Diane thought she had won. She thought I would roll over and accept that she stole what was rightfully mine, but she had no idea I was playing a different game. I had the evidence, the power, and the element of surprise. But the real question is, what happens when the manipulator gets outplayed? Will Diane go down without a fight, or does she have one last trick up her sleeve? Comment 111 if you think I've already won, or 222 foot if you think she's got a desperate move left. Let's see who gets it right. My father's face was a storm of emotions, confusion, disbelief, and something else I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was shame. Maybe it was regret. But I didn't have time to decipher it because Diane was already stepping forward, her face carefully composed. slipping effortlessly into damage control. "Richard, please," she said, her voice smooth and practiced, the same voice she had used for years to manipulate him. "This is ridiculous. Olivia is blowing things out of proportion. You know how she is always dramatic, always looking for a fight. She's been jealous of Sophia for years, and now she's just trying to punish me for loving her like a daughter." I watched my father's eyes flicker with hesitation, and for a brief second, the old fear crept in. The fear that, despite everything, he would still choose to believe her. That he would fall for her lies just like he always had. But not this time. Not anymore. I refused to let that happen. I took a step closer, my voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Jealous? Diane, I don't think you understand what's happening here. This isn't some petty sibling rivalry. This is fraud. This is a crime. And I have the proof to back it up." Diane's nostrils flared, but she held her ground. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "This is a family matter. You're really going to involve lawyers, the police? Drag your own father's name through the mud over some money you don't even need?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're right about one thing, Diane. This isn't about money. It's about you thinking you could take whatever you wanted, that you could rewrite reality to fit whatever story made you look like the victim. But here's the thing, you didn't just try to steal from me. You stole from my mother, from her legacy, from the one thing she left behind to make sure I had a future. And you thought I'd let you get away with it?" Sophia, who had been quiet until now, suddenly sprang to her feet, her face flushed with anger. "Mom was just trying to help me. You don't understand, Olivia. You don't care about this family. You left. You never came back." I turned my gaze to her, steady, unshaken. "I left because there was no place for me here. Because your mother made damn sure I was treated like an outsider in my own home. And don't stand there and pretend like you didn't enjoy every second of it." Sophia's jaw tightened. "That's not fair, isn't it?" I shot back. "Tell me, Sophia, what exactly have you struggled for? Because I worked my way through college. I paid my own rent. I built my own career without anyone pulling strings for me. Meanwhile, you had everything handed to you on a silver platter, dad's money, mom's connections. And now, apparently, my trust fund, too. So tell me, what exactly is unfair here?" Sophia's mouth opened, then closed. She had nothing to say. Diane, however, wasn't done. "Richard," she said, turning back to my father, her voice thick with faux sincerity, "this is what she does. She twists things. She makes you doubt your own family. You know me. You know I would never do anything to hurt this family. Olivia's just looking for someone to blame, and I'm the easy target." I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. "You know what's funny, Diane? You're right. I used to think I was the problem. I used to think that if I just tried harder, if I was quieter, if I was more agreeable, then maybe you'd finally see me as part of this family. But the truth is, no matter what I did, you were never going to let that happen. And you know why? Because I was a reminder that you weren't my mother, that no matter how much control you took, no matter how much you manipulated Dad, you could never erase me completely. And that's why you hate me." Diane's face twisted, her mask slipping for just a fraction of a second. And that was all I needed to see. My father finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Is it true?" he asked, looking at Diane, his expression unreadable. "Did you try to take Olivia's trust fund?" Diane's lips parted, but before she could speak, I cut in. "Don't ask her, Dad. Ask the bank. Ask Mr. Harrison. Because I have the documents right here." I held up my phone, "and I can send them to you right now if you'd rather see the truth for yourself instead of hearing another one of her stories." His eyes shifted from me to Diane, then back again. He swallowed hard, and for the first time in years, I saw something change in his expression. Recognition. Doubt. The realization that maybe, just maybe, he had been blind for far too long. Diane must have sensed it too, because her entire demeanor shifted. The desperation bled into her features, her voice softening, the anger giving way to something more calculated. "Richard, please," she pleaded, reaching for his hand. "You can't seriously believe." He pulled his hand away. A beat of silence, and then his voice low, steady, and final. "I want the truth." Diane's face went pale. She opened her mouth, closed it, then turned to Sophia as if searching for support. But Sophia didn't say a word. She just stood there, her arms wrapped around herself, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. I watched as my father exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked tired, more tired than I had ever seen him. He shook his head slowly, like he was trying to process years of lies in just a few seconds. Then, finally, he turned back to me. "Send me everything," he said, his voice heavy. I nodded. "I will." And just like that, something shifted. Diane had spent years perfecting her web of manipulation, years twisting my father into someone who only saw what she wanted him to see. But now, that web had started to unravel. And for the first time in a long, long time, I wasn't the one standing on the outside looking in. I was the one holding the power. My father sat there, his shoulders slumped, his face drawn in a way that made him look older than I'd ever seen him. He was holding my phone now, scrolling through the documents, his brows furrowed in concentration. I could see the moment the truth sank in, the moment the weight of what Diane had done finally settled onto his shoulders. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head, almost as if he couldn't believe what he was reading. And maybe he couldn't. Maybe it was easier to live in denial than to admit he had spent years married to a woman who had been robbing him blind while destroying any chance of a relationship between him and his own daughter. Diane, ever the manipulator, wasn't done yet. She turned to him, her voice softer now, dripping with false sincerity. "Richard, sweetheart, you know how this looks, but it's not what you think. I was just trying to help Sophia. She's starting her life, she's getting married, and Olivia..." She gestured toward me like I was some stranger off the street. "She doesn't need the money. She's successful. She has a career. What harm was there in shifting things around a little to make sure both girls had a fair shot?" I scoffed, crossing my arms. "Fair shot?" I repeated. "You mean stealing my trust fund, committing fraud, and forging signatures? That's what you call fair?" Diane's jaw clenched, but she didn't drop the act. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Olivia. You were never going to use that money. It was just sitting there." My father looked up then, his expression unreadable. "That money wasn't yours to touch, Diane." The shift in the air was subtle, but I felt it. Diane did too. A flicker of something crossed her face, worry, maybe even fear, but she masked it quickly. "Richard," she tried again, reaching for his hand. "I was only thinking of the family." He pulled his hand away. "No," he said, his voice quieter but firm. "You were thinking of yourself, just like you always have." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Diane stood there, frozen, her lips pressed into a thin line as she processed the fact that, for the first time in years, my father wasn't falling for her lies. But, like the skilled manipulator she wasn't going to go down without a fight. She let out a humorless laugh, shaking her head. "Unbelievable," she muttered. "After everything I've done for this family, this is the thanks I get?" She turned to Sophia then, desperation creeping into her voice. "Sophia, say something. You know I was only trying to help you." Sophia, who had been silent until now, shifted uncomfortably on the couch. I saw the way her fingers twisted in her lap, the way she avoided my gaze. For all her entitlement, for all the years she had spent looking down on me, she wasn't completely blind to what was happening. Maybe she had convinced herself that Diane had everything under control, that she wasn't actually stealing, just rearranging things. But now, faced with undeniable proof, even she couldn't pretend anymore. "Mom," she started, her voice hesitant. I didn't know you forged documents." Diane's head snapped toward her, her eyes narrowing. "You don't know what you're talking about. But you did, didn't you?" Sophia pressed. her voice growing shakier. You said everything was legal, that Dad approved it. But if that's true, why is there proof that you tried to take the money without permission? Diane let out a sharp breath, her patience clearly wearing thin. You're being ridiculous, Sophia. I did this for you. Sophia swallowed hard, her face paling. Then, why do I feel like I just watched you burn our entire family to the ground? Diane took a step back, like the words had physically hit her. For a moment, I saw something crack in her expression, something almost vulnerable. But then she straightened, squared her shoulders, and turned back to my father, her face hardening. You're really going to let her turn you against me? She demanded. After all these years? After everything we've built together? My father rubbed a hand over his face, looking exhausted. Diane, I don't even know who you are anymore. She flinched, but quickly masked it with anger. You know exactly who I am, she snapped. I'm the woman who kept this family together, while Olivia ran off to chase her career. I'm the woman who raised Sophia, who took care of you. And this is how you repay me? My father shook his head. You didn't take care of me, Diane. You took advantage of me. The words landed heavy in the room, and for the first time, Diane didn't have a response. I exhaled slowly, watching as she struggled to regain control, to find some way to manipulate the situation back in her favor. But she couldn't. Not this time. The game was over, and she knew it. I stepped forward, my voice quiet but firm. You spent years trying to push me out, Diane. You tried to rewrite history, to make sure I was nothing more than an afterthought in this house. But the truth always comes out. And now you have to face the consequences. Her eyes locked onto mine, burning with resentment. You think you've won? She whispered. I tilted my head slightly. No, Diane, I said, my voice calm. I know I have. And for the first time, she didn't argue. She didn't fight. She just stood there, staring at me, her face unreadable. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the room. I didn't let out a breath until I heard the sound of her footsteps disappearing up the stairs. My father let out a heavy sigh, sinking into his chair like the weight of everything had finally caught up to him. Sophia was still sitting on the couch, looking dazed, like she wasn't sure how any of this had happened. And me? I just stood there, staring at the space where Diane had been, feeling something shift deep inside me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being cast aside. I wasn't the one being dismissed. I was the one in control. I watched Diane disappear up the stairs, her spine rigid, her movements sharp with barely concealed rage. She was retreating, but I knew better than to assume she was done. Diane wasn't the type to go down without a fight. She was a woman who had built her life around control, manipulation, and deception. Losing wasn't in her nature, and right now, she was wounded. That made her dangerous. My father let out a long breath beside me, running a hand over his face like he was trying to rub away the years of blind trust he had given her. Sophia sat frozen on the couch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her gaze fixed on the floor. She looked small, defeated. A strange silence settled between us, heavy and suffocating. The house, the same house that had once felt like a prison to me, was now eerily still. I could hear the distant hum of a car passing outside, the faint creak of the old wooden floorboards beneath my father's chair as he shifted his weight. Then, finally, he spoke. I don't even know where to begin, he murmured, almost to himself. His voice was raw, tired in a way I'd never heard before. How could I have been so blind? I turned to him, studying his face. He looked broken, not just by the betrayal, but by the realization that he had spent years ignoring it, that he had allowed it to happen. And for so long, that was all I had ever wanted, for him to see the truth, to see Diane for what she really was. But now that the moment was here, I didn't feel the satisfaction I had always imagined. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like standing in the wreckage of something that had been doomed from the start. You weren't blind, Dad, I said finally, my voice softer than I expected. You just didn't want to see it. His gaze flicked to mine, something flickering in his expression. He knew I was right, but admitting it out loud was another thing entirely. He let out another heavy sigh, rubbing a hand over his jaw. I should have protected you, he admitted. I should have stopped it before it got this far. One swallowed, my throat tightening. Yeah, I said, because anything else would have been a lie. You should have. Another beat of silence. Then Sophia shifted beside me, her voice quiet, hesitant. What happens now? I glanced at her, surprised by the uncertainty in her tone. Sophia had always been so sure of herself, so confident in the life Diane had built for her. But now, with the truth laid bare, with the foundation of her perfect world crumbling beneath her, she looked lost. Diane's going to fight this, I said, because I knew she was thinking the same thing I was. She's not just going to accept that she lost. My father stiffened. You think she'll try to take legal action? I let out a humorless laugh. She's already committed fraud. The only legal action she could take now is trying to cut a deal to avoid charges. I shook my head. No, she's not going to try to fix this. She's going to try to destroy whatever she can on her way out. Sophia inhaled sharply, her hands gripping the fabric of her sweater. So what do? I turned to my father. We cut her off, completely. She has no access to the trust fund, but we need to make sure she can't touch anything else. The bank, the house, your accounts, everything needs to be locked down. Because if there's one thing I know for sure, it's that Diane never played fair. And if she thinks she's losing, she's going to lash out. My father nodded slowly, the gears turning in his head. I'll call the bank in the morning, he said, his voice steadier now. And I'll talk to my lawyer. I want to make sure she can't get a single cent more from me. It should have felt like a victory. But the truth was, Diane had already taken so much more than money. She had taken years. She had taken trust. She had taken a father away from his daughter and replaced him with a man who had barely noticed me, unless it was convenient. No amount of legal action could fix that. Sophia let out a shaky breath beside me, rubbing her temples. I still can't believe this, she muttered. I mean, I knew Mom could be controlling, but I never thought she would actually... She stopped herself, shaking her head like she couldn't even say the words. I studied her carefully. Did you know? Her head snapped up, her eyes wide. What? No! I mean, not really. She told me the money was being transferred, but she made it sound like it was legal. Like Dad had agreed to it. She swallowed hard, looking away. I didn't ask questions. I should have, but I didn't. I wasn't sure whether to believe her. Maybe she was telling the truth. Maybe she had just chosen to see what she wanted to see, the same way my father had. Either way, it didn't really matter now. You still benefited from it, I said, my voice even. Whether you knew or not. Sophia flinched, like the words physically hurt. But she didn't argue. She just looked down at her hands, silent. My father exhaled. I need to get some air, he muttered, pushing himself up from the chair. I need to think. I watched him walk toward the front door, his shoulders hunched like the weight of it all was finally pressing down on him. And maybe it was. Maybe for the first time in years, he was really feeling it. I turned back to Sophia. Diane's not done, I said quietly. You know that, right? Sophia nodded, her face pale. Yeah, I know. And as much as I hated to admit it, I knew it too. Diane was backed into a corner, and women like her didn't go down without a fight. She wasn't going to let this be the end, but neither was I. I stayed in the living room long after my father had stepped outside, the silence pressing against my skin like a weighted blanket. Sophia sat across from me, looking like she wanted to disappear into the cushions. I could see the wheels turning in her head, the slow realization sinking in that the foundation she had built her entire life on was cracking beneath her. She opened her mouth a few times like she wanted to say something, but nothing came out. I didn't push. Let her sit with it. Let her feel it. For once in her life, she was going to have to deal with consequences. I glanced toward the stairs. Diane was still up there, probably seething, plotting her next move. She was smart enough to know that she had lost this round, but that didn't mean she wouldn't come back swinging. No, if I knew anything about Diane, it was that she wouldn't leave quietly, and that thought sat uneasily in my stomach. The sharp ring of my phone cut through the quiet. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. Mr. Harrison, the first, swiped to answer. "Tell me you have good news," I said, keeping my voice low. "Depends on how you look at it," he replied, his tone clipped. "We've locked down the trust, as you know. But Diane's been making other moves. I had a feeling she'd try something else, so I put some extra eyes on your father's accounts. Turns out, she's been slowly siphoning money for years. Small amounts, strategically placed withdrawals. But it adds up, Olivia. We're talking about 6 figures missing." My grip on the phone tightened. My pulse pounded in my ears. "She's been stealing from him this entire time?" "Looks like it," Mr. Harrison said. "And if I had to guess, I'd say she's preparing to drain whatever she can before she gets pushed out completely." Of course she was. Diane had never been the kind of woman to simply accept defeat. If she knew she was on the way out, she'd make sure to take as much with her as possible. I clenched my jaw, my free hand curling into a fist against my thigh. "Can we stop her?" "We already have," he said. "I contacted the bank this morning and they froze all withdrawals under her name. She won't be able to touch another dime." Relief flooded my chest, but it was quickly replaced by something darker. Rage. Because it wasn't just about the money. It was about control. Diane had spent years manipulating my father, turning him against me, ensuring that every part of this family bent to her will. And now, when she saw her grip slipping, she had resorted to stealing outright. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady. "Send me everything. I want my father to see exactly what she's done." "You got it," Mr. Harrison replied. "But Olivia, be careful. She's backed into a corner now. People like Diane, they don't go down without a fight." I hung up and took a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm, to keep my head clear. This wasn't over. Not yet. Sophia shifted in her seat. "What was that about?" I turned to her, my eyes narrowing. "She's been stealing from Dad for years, and she tried to clean out his accounts before we could stop her." Sophia paled. "Wait, what?" "No, that can't be right. It is," I cut in, "and I have proof." Sophia's mouth opened, then closed. I could see the war happening in her head, the part of her that wanted to defend Diane, to believe that there was some logical explanation. But there wasn't. The truth was right in front of her, and she had no choice but to see it now. I stood, slipping my phone into my pocket. "I need to talk to Dad." I walked toward the front door and stepped outside. The evening air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of traffic from the main road. My father stood at the edge of the porch, staring out at the darkening sky. I knew this was hitting him harder than he wanted to admit. Maybe he had suspected it all along but had been too afraid to face it. Maybe he had just been willfully blind. Either way, the truth was here now, staring him in the face, and there was no ignoring it. "Dad," I said, stepping beside him. He exhaled heavily. "I know that look," he muttered. "What now?" I swallowed the lump in my throat and handed him my phone, the email from Mr. Harrison open on the screen. "She's been stealing from you for years. She tried to take whatever she could before we locked everything down." His hands trembled slightly as he took the phone, his eyes scanning the numbers, the withdrawals, the evidence. I saw his jaw tighten, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. When he finally looked at me, there was something different in his expression, a finality I hadn't seen before. "I should have seen it," he murmured. "I should have stopped it." "You can stop it now," I said, my voice firm. "But you have to make a choice, Dad. You can't keep pretending this is salvageable." Diane isn't going to back down. She isn't going to apologize. She's going to fight, and if you don't act first, she's going to take as much as she can on her way out. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "You're right," he said. "It's time to end this." Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived, because just as he handed my phone back to me, the front door swung open. Diane stood in the doorway, her face hard, her eyes sharp and full of something I didn't like. She had heard us. "So that's it then?" she said, stepping onto the porch. "You're just going to throw me out? After everything I've done for this family?" My father turned to her, his face unreadable. "You mean after everything you've taken from this family?" Her lips curled. "This is her fault," she spat, glaring at me. "She's been waiting for this moment. You don't see it, do you? She's been manipulating you just as much as you think I have." I laughed, shaking my head. "You're really going to play the victim here?" I gestured toward my father. "You stole from him. You stole from me. And now that you're finally facing the consequences, you're trying to spin it like I'm the villain?" Diane stepped forward, her hands clenched into fists. "You think you've won, don't you?" she hissed. I held her gaze, unwavering. "No, Diane. I think you've lost." And for the first time, I saw the fear in her eyes. The realization that this was it, that her reign over this family was over. She knew it. And now, so did we. The night air was thick, pressing against my skin as I stood face to face with Diane, the porch light casting harsh shadows across her face. She was seething, her eyes sharp with fury, her mouth curled into something between a sneer and a snarl. For years, she had been the one in control. She had called the shots, pulled the strings, rewritten reality to suit her needs. But not anymore. The power she had held for so long was slipping through her fingers, and she knew it. My father stood beside me, silent but firm, his arms crossed over his chest. His presence was solid, but I could sense the internal battle waging inside him, the weight of years of manipulation, pressing down, the realization that the woman he had trusted, the woman he had loved, had never truly been on his side. I had spent years waiting for him to see her for what she really was, but now that the moment was here, I didn't feel victorious. I felt exhausted. "You want me gone?" Diane hissed, her voice laced with venom. "Fine, but don't think for a second that I'm leaving empty-handed." I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head. "You don't have a choice, Diane. The accounts are locked. The trust is untouchable. You have nothing left to take." Her jaw clenched, and for the first time, I saw something flicker in her eyes, something desperate. She had always played the long game, positioning herself so that she could take and take without consequence. But she had never prepared for this. She had never expected to lose. Her gaze snapped to my father. "You're really going to let her do this to me?" His face was unreadable, but his voice was steady. "You did this to yourself." Diane let out a sharp breath, shaking her head as she took a step back. "You're making a mistake, Richard," she warned. "You think she's on your side now, but she'll turn on you just like she turned on me. You were always so blind when it came to her." My father's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He didn't need to. The silence said everything. Diane's lips curled, but it wasn't a smile. "You're pathetic," she spat at him before turning her glare back to me. "And you think you've won?" I met her gaze head-on, unshaken. "No, Diane, I know I have." And just like that, the last thread holding her together snapped. She lunged. I barely had time to react before her hands were on me, fingers clawing at my arms, her nails digging into my skin. I stumbled back, caught off guard by the sheer force of it, but I didn't fall. My father stepped forward, grabbing her wrist, pulling her away from me with more strength than I thought he had left in him. "Enough," he said, his voice low and dangerous, the kind of voice that stopped people in their tracks. Diane struggled against his grip, her breath coming fast, her eyes wild. "You're making a mistake," she screamed. "You'll regret this, both of you." I straightened, rolling my shoulders back, ignoring the sting where her nails had torn through my skin. My pulse was pounding, but I wouldn't let her see it. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. "Get out, Diane," my father said, his voice devoid of any warmth, "before I call the police." Her expression twisted, but she must have seen something in his eyes, something final. Because instead of fighting, instead of clawing for another way to manipulate, she jerked her arm free and took a step back. "You'll pay for this," she whispered, and it wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. Then she turned and stormed inside. I let out a slow breath, pressing my hands against my thighs to steady myself. My father was watching the door, his face unreadable, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of it all pressing down on him. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. We both knew this wasn't over. A few minutes passed before Sophia appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her expression unreadable. "She's packing," she said quietly, "but she's not leaving without a fight." I nodded, swallowing hard. "I know, and I meant it." Because women like Diane didn't just walk away. They found ways to sink their claws in deeper, to drag you down with them. And if she couldn't win, if she couldn't take what she wanted, she would make damn sure she took something else instead. The question was, what? I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room long after my father had gone to bed, the weight of everything pressing against my chest like a heavy stone. Diane was still upstairs, packing, or maybe just stewing in her own fury, plotting whatever desperate move she had left. I knew better than to think this was over. Women like her didn't just walk away. They schemed, they struck back. And Diane? She was backed into a corner which made her more dangerous than ever. The house felt different now. The walls, the floors, the very air inside it, it all carried a strange tension, like the place itself was waiting for the final blow. I glanced at the clock on the wall. Nearly 3 a.m. Still no movement from upstairs. My body was exhausted, but my mind was sharp, restless, waiting. I turned when I heard footsteps creak down the hallway. Sophia appeared in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself, her face drawn and pale. "You're still up," she murmured. "So are you," I said, watching her carefully. She hesitated before stepping into the room, lowering herself onto the couch across from me. She looked lost, small, like she was finally seeing the truth, but didn't know what to do with it. "She's not going to leave quietly," she said after a moment. I sighed, rubbing a hand down my face. "I know." Sophia swallowed, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "I think she's going to try to take something. I don't know what, but she's too angry to just walk away." I studied her for a moment, searching her face for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of lingering loyalty to Diane. But she looked afraid, not for Diane, for herself, for what might come next. "Did she say something to you?" I asked. She shook her head quickly. "No, but I can tell. I've seen her like this before. When things don't go her way, she doesn't just accept it, she lashes out." I leaned back, my fingers drumming against the armrest. "She's already lost the money. The accounts are locked. The trust is untouchable. What else could she possibly try to take?" Sophia looked down, hesitating. Then, softly, she said, "Dad." The word hit me like a cold slap. I sat up straighter, my pulse quickening. Of course, Diane wouldn't just let go. She wouldn't leave without making one last attempt to manipulate him, to twist the situation back in her favor. She had spent years wrapping him around her little finger, and now that he was slipping away from her grasp, she was going to use every trick she had left to pull him back in. I exhaled sharply. She's going to try to guilt him into staying with her. Sophia nodded, her expression grim. Or at least make him question everything. She's good at that, Olivia. She makes you doubt yourself. She makes you wonder if maybe you're the one who's wrong. I clenched my jaw. I had spent my entire teenage years watching her do exactly that. She had convinced my father that I was distant, that I didn't care about this family, that I was the problem. And now, after everything, after the fraud, the lies, the theft, she was going to try to play the victim one last time. Not this time. I pushed myself off the couch, my mind already racing. Where is she now? Sophia hesitated. In their room. She locked the door. Of course she did. I glanced toward the staircase, my heart pounding. I had to get ahead of this. I had to make sure she didn't sink her claws in one last time. Without another word, I headed upstairs, moving quickly but quietly. The hallway was dark, but I could see the faint light seeping from beneath the master bedroom door. I stood there for a moment, listening. At first, nothing. Then the muffled sound of movement. A voice. Low. Whispering. My stomach turned. I didn't hesitate. I knocked once hard. Dad? Silence. Then, after a beat, Diane's voice, sickly sweet. Go away, Olivia. This is between me and my husband. I didn't move. Dad? I called again. Still nothing. That's when I heard it the faintest sound. A sharp inhale, barely audible, like someone struggling to breathe through thick emotion. Enough. I grabbed the doorknob and twisted. Locked. I gritted my teeth. Dad, if you want me to leave, tell me to leave. Otherwise, I'm not going anywhere. A pause. Then, finally, his voice. Weak. Shaky. Olivia. I didn't wait. I braced myself and slammed my shoulder into the door. It burst open with a loud crack, and what I saw on the other side made my blood boil. Diane was standing inches from my father, her hands gripping his face, her eyes locked onto his like she was pouring every ounce of manipulation she had left into his soul. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his shoulders slumped, his face pale. He looked drained, exhausted, like he had been listening to her for hours, letting her fill his head with whatever twisted reality she had spun to justify herself. Her eyes snapped to me, fury flashing across her face. How dare you? Get your hands off of him! I snapped, my voice ice cold. She didn't move. I took a step forward. Now, Diane. She let out a breathless laugh, but there was no humor in it. Oh, Olivia, you think you've won just because you took some money from me? You think you've beaten me? She shook her head, tightening her grip on my father's face. I built this life. I built this family. And you? You've always been an outsider, just like your mother. Something in me snapped. I reached forward, grabbed her wrist, and yanked her hand off of him. She gasped, stumbling back, her eyes wide with shock. You little... I turned to my father, ignoring her completely. Dad, I said, my voice softer now but firm. Listen to me. Whatever she's telling you, it's a lie. You know that, don't you? He swallowed hard, blinking rapidly like he was trying to pull himself out of a fog. I don't know anymore. Yes, you do, I pressed. You've seen the proof. You know what she did. And now she's just trying to make you question yourself again. Just like she always has. Diane scoffed. Oh, please. He loves me. He's always loved me. I turned back to her, my heart pounding. No, Diane. He loved the woman he thought you were, but that woman never existed. She opened her mouth, but for once, no words came out. I looked back at my father. You have a choice, I said softly. But if you let her stay, if you let her manipulate you again, I won't be here to watch it happen. Silence. Then, finally, my father let out a slow breath, straightened his shoulders, and looked Diane in the eyes. I want you out, he said. Diane went still. My heart pounded. And just like that, the war she had spent years waging was over. Diane stood frozen in the dim light of the bedroom, her breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts, as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. My father's words lingered in the air, thick with finality, heavier than anything that had ever been said in this house. I want you out. 4 simple words, but for Diane, they might as well have been a death sentence. She had spent years securing her place here, weaving her web, manipulating her way into control. And now, with nothing left to hold on to, she was standing on the edge of a reality she had never prepared for, one where she lost. For a moment, I thought she might lash out again, that she would throw one last cruel insult my way, twist the narrative to make herself the victim, beg my father for another chance. But something in her must have realized that this time it wouldn't work. Not after everything. The evidence. The lies. The stolen money. There was no spinning this. No rewriting history to fit her version of events. The game was over. Slowly, she straightened, rolling her shoulders back as if trying to salvage the last shred of dignity she had left. "Fine," she said, her voice eerily calm. "You want me gone? I'll leave. But don't think for a second that this is over." I met her gaze, steady, unwavering. "It is over, Diane. You just don't know how to accept it." Her lips curled, but there was no amusement in it. Just quiet, simmering rage. She turned to my father. "I'll need time to get my things." "You have until tomorrow morning," he said, his voice cold, detached. "Then I want you gone." She let out a quiet scoff, shaking her head as she grabbed her suitcase and stormed past me, her shoulder brushing mine roughly. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I just stood there, watching as she disappeared down the hallway. A long silence stretched between my father and me, thick with unspoken words. He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped together, his gaze fixed on the floor like he was trying to process the weight of everything at once. I had spent years waiting for this moment, for him to finally open his eyes, to see Diane for who she really was. But now that it had happened, I didn't feel the triumph I had expected. I sat beside him, letting the silence settle between us before finally speaking. "Are you okay?" He let out a slow breath, rubbing his hands together. "I don't know," he admitted. "I should have seen it. I should have stopped it a long time ago." I studied him for a moment. My father, the man who had once been my whole world before he had. Let Diane rewrite everything. The man who had turned his back on me, let me feel like I didn't belong in my own home. The years of neglect, the absence, the way he had let her control every aspect of our lives. I could still feel the sting of it, the scars it had left. But sitting here, seeing him like this, I also saw something else. Regret. "You see it now," I said softly. He nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah," he whispered. "Yeah, I do." It wasn't an apology. Not really, but it was something. I let out a slow breath, nodding. "Diane's going to try something," I said. "She's not just going to walk away without making this as painful as possible." He nodded again. "I know. But she has nothing left to hold on to. Not anymore." And for the first time, I believed him. The next morning, Diane was gone. She didn't make a scene. She didn't throw one last fit or try to convince my father to change his mind. She just packed her bags, took her car, and left. There was no goodbye, no final words. Just silence. Sophia didn't leave right away. She lingered, unsure, her entire world upended. She had built her life on Diane's version of reality, believing every twisted narrative, every manipulation. And now she was left to sort through the wreckage. She stood in the doorway as I packed my own things, shifting awkwardly, like she wanted to say something but didn't know how. "I didn't know," she finally said. "Not really. Not about the money, or how bad it was. I trusted her." I zipped up my suitcase, glancing at her. "I know." She bit her lip, hesitating. "So what now?" I shrugged, grabbing my coat. "That's up to you." She blinked, like she wasn't sure what to do with that answer. But it was the only one I had. I wasn't going to hold her hand through this. She had choices to make who she wanted to be outside of Diane's shadow. And that was something she would have to figure out on her own. As I stepped outside, the crisp autumn air wrapped around me, fresh, new. The house behind me was the same, but it felt different now, like a weight had been lifted, like something had finally been set right. I had spent years carrying the resentment, the anger, the ache of being pushed aside, and now, for the first time, I felt free. My father stood beside me on the porch, staring out at the road where Diane had driven away. He looked tired, but lighter somehow, like he had finally let go of something he had been holding on to for too long. "You don't have to leave," he said quietly. "You know that, right?" I smiled, but it was small, sad. I do have to leave, Dad, but that doesn't mean I won't come back. He nodded, like he understood, like he knew this was something we had to rebuild slowly, carefully. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, I saw my father. Not the man Diane had twisted, but the man he used to be. "I'll call you," I said. "I'd like that." And with that, I walked to my car, slid into the driver's seat, and took one last look at the house, the place that had once been my prison, my battleground. Then I started the engine and drove away. It wasn't the perfect ending. There were still scars, still wounds that needed time to heal. But it was enough, because I had won. And just like that, it was over. Diane was gone. My father finally saw the truth. And I walked away knowing I had taken back what was mine. But here's the real lesson. In life, the people closest to you can be the ones waiting to betray you. So tell me, would you have seen the red flags? Could you have outsmarted Diane? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you loved this story, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and subscribe for more jaw-dropping betrayals, shocking twists, and real-life lessons that could save you from your own Diane one day. Trust isn't just given, it's earned. And sometimes the people closest to you are the ones waiting to betray you. Diane thought she could manipulate, steal, and rewrite history, but the truth always comes out. In America, where independence and financial security mean everything, protecting yourself isn't paranoia, it's survival. Check your accounts. Read the fine print. Document everything. Don't assume family means loyalty. People will take advantage if you let them. I learned the hard way, but you don't have to. Stay sharp, stay vigilant, and when someone tries to take what's yours, fight back, because no one will protect your future but you.